The Windigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tautly over its bones. With its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion was the ash gray of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets. The Windigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody. Its body was unclean, and it gave off a strange and eerie odor of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption. The word Wendigo roughly means the evil spirit who devours mankind, and it's a creature in Algonkin folklore, specifically the Anishinaabe in modern-day Canada and in the Great Lakes region. There are hundreds of stories about the Wendigo and around 35 to 40 recorded variations of the word. According to the legend, a Wendigo is a demon or an evil winter spirit that takes over anyone who has committed the sin of cannibalism. The first Wendigo was said to have been a warrior who made a deal with the devil. He gave up his soul in exchange for incredibly fearsome skills and a stature that would help him defeat his enemies and save his people. Although he won the fight, he was doomed to live the rest of his life as a monster, a Wendigo. He was then considered an outcast and was banished from his tribe and was cursed with a never-ending cannibalistic desire. The more it eats, the hungrier it gets, and the larger the meal, the larger the Wendigo becomes. A Wendigo doesn't have a gender, even though a man or a woman can become one. It's been described in many different ways, but there are some common traits. It's said to be 15 feet tall or as tall as a tree, and in some versions of the legend, it can only be seen head-on because it's too thin to be seen from the side. It's said that it looks like a walking corpse with blood-red eyes, pointed or animal-like ears, dog-like teeth, and a long tongue. Its lips are either blackened by frostbite or eaten away, and they may be missing toes and fingers. The lips are eaten away because of its insatiable appetite. It eats its own lips. If no humans are around, it may also eat moss, frogs, or mushrooms. Some say that their claws, their heart, or even their entire body is covered in a sheet of ice that makes it extremely difficult to kill. According to some, it can talk, but according to others, it can't. So instead, it hisses, whistles, and howls. Its feet are made of fire in some of the legends and are as large as snowshoes in others. It's also said that it smells like rotting flesh. Wendigo are stronger than a grizzly bear and are pretty much perfect hunters. And like most hunters, they know their territory very well. They can control the weather with dark magic, and their hearing and sense of smell are heightened. Their hearing is so heightened that it can hear a panicked heartbeat from miles away. They have the ability to walk across deep snow or over open water without sinking, and some say that they move with the speed of the wind, while others say that it walks as if it's falling apart. Regardless of whether it's fast or not, it doesn't necessarily need to chase down its victims because it can lure them in with its ability to mimic human voices, and it can sound like someone calling for help. It likes to play with its food, and it will race after its prey, it will upend trees, and it can also create animal stampedes and stir up ice storms and tornadoes. But if you think you're safe indoors, think again. The Wendigo can also unlock doors, where it'll go inside and devour everyone inside and convert the cabin into a place where they can hibernate. And Wendigos may hibernate for months or even years. You've probably seen images of a Wendigo with a stag skull or with antlers, but that's not originally how they were described by witnesses. Wendigos are now portrayed as a ravenous creature when originally they were used by some to deter human greed and to prevent children from wandering off. It was similar to the boogeyman in some tribes. Cooperation in sharing food and possessions was vital for survival in the wilderness. And because the Algonkin lived in an extremely harsh environment, starvation, especially during the winter months, was a part of life. And if there was a lack of food, the entire community would go hungry. If food was plentiful, they would still only take what they needed in order to avoid becoming self-indulgent. If someone refused to share, especially during desperate times, they were considered a monster. To this day, the Wendigo is still used as a warning or a reminder to avoid greed and self-indulgence. Anishinaabe scholar and writer Basil Johnston saw multiple national corporations as a modern-day Wendigo because they took over their communities, they're driven by a pursuit of profit, and they devour resources, not for need, but for greed. The Wendigo legend became popular in 1910 because of Algernon Blackwood's short story called The Wendigo. And the story is about a hunting trip in the frozen tundra of Ontario and an encounter with the Wendigo. And if you're familiar with scary stories to tell in the dark, there is a story about a Wendigo, and it is inspired on that particular short story. Since the Wendigo is a cold-weathered creature, most sightings have been reported in Canada and colder northern states in the U.S. like Minnesota. There have also been several sightings in New York State, but the vast majority of Wendigo sightings happened between the 1800s and the 1920s. And a Wendigo was allegedly seen near a town called Roseau in northern Minnesota during this same time. And each time it was reported, an unexpected death followed, and then it was gone. During the turn of the 20th century, a large number of Algonkins went missing, and they believed the Wendigo was responsible. And every so often, an alleged sighting or an unexplained sound is reported, with the most recent being in 2019. An avid hunter was out with his wife and their grandson when they heard mysterious howls and shrieks in the Canadian wilderness. He said, "When it let out the first scream, I thought it was a moose. But my mind changed when it screamed again and again. I've heard many different animals in the wild, but nothing like this." The howls initially came from the distance, but soon they appeared to move much closer. We could hear it moving. It sounded kind of heavy, but my wife, she got scared, so we picked up our grandson and started walking fast towards the vehicle. I'll put the link to the video in a pinned comment so you can hear what they heard. And in my opinion, it sounds pretty terrifying, so you may want to watch it in the daytime. It's really scary to me. Some people think that it sounds like a Sasquatch. Kenora, Ontario is considered by some to be the Wendigo capital of the world because of all of the sightings, and many still believe that the Wendigo roams the woods and the prairies of northern Minnesota and Canada to this day. Most Wendigo stories begin with an individual or a group that has been trapped and isolated in the freezing wilderness without food for an extended period of time. But that's not the only way that someone can become a Wendigo. A person can be cursed by a shaman, or they can be bitten by another Wendigo. If you dream of a Wendigo, you may become one yourself. Some will sing to the Wendigo or make sacrifices to it to ward it off. It's sad and terrifying at the same time to come to the realization that this flesh-eating creature was once a human who was simply starving and made a horrific choice in order to survive. If a Wendigo ever reverts to its human form, it usually becomes overcome with remorse and it begs to be killed before it has a chance to turn back into a Wendigo again. And labeling someone a Wendigo was also a way to explain mental illness and other serious disorders. One of the most famous Wendigo hunters was a Cree shaman named Jack Fiddler. Like his father, he was famous for his ability to conjure animals and to protect his people from spells. It's said that he killed around 14 Wendigo in his lifetime, and the last one resulted in his arrest at the age of 87. Jack and his son Joseph were tried for the murder of a Cree Indian woman. They pleaded guilty, but said that she had to be killed before she murdered other members of the tribe. She had become possessed by the spirit of a Wendigo and was on the verge of transforming into one. Jack ended up escaping and ending his life, while Joseph died of consumption a few days before he would have been released. And they both gave credibility to the idea that Wendigos were real. And Fiddler's brother, Peter, was killed after he became a Wendigo when food ran out on a trading expedition. By the late 19th century, scientists were beginning to recognize a pattern of symptoms in many First Nations patients. Their symptoms were nausea, depression, loss of appetite, and an intense fear of turning into a Wendigo. The symptoms were almost always triggered by an extended period of starvation and isolation in the deep snow in the wilderness, and this became known as Wendigo Psychosis, which is a mental condition in which patients feel possessed by cannibalistic desires. It's considered a culture-bound syndrome because it tends to only occur amongst people living in Canada or the Great Lakes of the United States. In some First Nations communities, destruction of the environment is also seen as symptoms of Wendigo psychosis. It's important to note that cannibalism wasn't seen as the desperate act of a sane person, but as a chronic disease of a deranged person. In most cases, it's believed that those outside of the culture are immune to both becoming a victim of a Wendigo or becoming one themselves. In 1979, John Long, a Hudson's Bay trader traveling through Ontario, came across a white Wendigo. The man didn't transform into a Wendigo outwardly, but he did exhibit the classic symptoms of Wendigo psychosis. One of the most widely reported cases of Wendigo psychosis is that of Swift Runner, a Cree trapper from Alberta, Canada, who murdered his wife and 6 children. In 1875, he was a guide for the Northwest Mounted Police. During the winter of 1878-1879, Swift Runner, his family, along with several other Cree families, were starving. Emergency food supplies were available about 25 miles away, but he never attempted to travel there. His oldest son was the first to die of starvation, and at some point, Swift Runner developed Wendigo psychosis. He claimed to be possessed by a Wendigo at the time of the crime and was hanged at Fort Saskatchewan. His case is one of the most well-known, but there were many reports in dozens of communities from northern Quebec to the Rockies in the early 20th century, but the reports date back centuries. Many of the reports were very similar to Swift Runner's case. According to legend, it's nearly impossible to escape a Wendigo, but even if you could escape, you'd probably be destroyed mentally and driven insane. A wounded Wendigo can simply regenerate, so it's believed that it can return from the dead if its heart isn't destroyed completely. Its heart has to be removed and melted in a fire, and many legends mention that by destroying its heart, you'll release, but also kill, the human that's trapped within the creature. What would you do if you were deprived of food and thought that you were going to die? What would you do to survive?